Hello, I'm Simon Whistler. You're watching Today I Found Out, and in the video today, the bizarre story of the Sex.com heist. Just before we get started, I do want to say that this video is brought to you by Dashlane. Dashlane is a secure password manager that goes above and beyond. Yeah, they do the auto login, they keep all your passwords super secure, but they also actively keep you safe by making it super easy to change insecure passwords, as well as alerting you to any data breaches that might affect you. Dashlane is just a better way to manage your passwords. Sign up for free today at www.dashlane.com/TodayIFoundOut, and if you want to go premium, just use the code TodayIFoundOut, one word, to get 10% off their premium features. In 1983, Paul Mockapetris proposed a distributed database of internet names and address pairs, now simply known as the Domain Name System, or DNS. This is essentially a distributed phone book linking a domain's name to its address, allowing you to type in something like TodayIFoundOut.com instead of the IP address of the website, which would be a whole lot harder to remember. The distributed version of this system, it allowed for a decentralized approach to this phone book. Previous to this, a central hosts.txt file was maintained at Stanford Research Institute that could then be downloaded and used by other systems. Now, even by 1983, this was becoming a bit of a problem to maintain, which ultimately led to the previously mentioned domain name system. Now, these were the Wild West days of the internet, and domain names were first being registered for commercial use. Indeed, Symbolics.com kicked things off when it was registered to the Symbolics Computer Corporation on March 15th, 1985. Now, at this point, really not very many people had any idea how big this whole internet thing was going to be in the next few decades. As a result of all of this, domain names were vastly underestimated in value to a pretty comical degree. Examples of domain names that were snapped up in the halcyon days of the early 1990s by savvy internet denizens include beer.com, which was later sold in 2004 for $7 million, Hotel.com, which was sold in 2011 for $11 million, and, well, the subject of today's video, which is, of course, Sex.com. This particular domain was registered by one Gary Kremen for free, thanks to the National Science Foundation footing the bill at the time. While Kremen has run or invested in a myriad of successful businesses since, he is perhaps best known today as the creator of Match.com, which presently brings in a few $100 million per year. Although, funnily enough, owing to his removal as CEO by an amazingly inept board who likewise demonstrated a spectacular lack of vision and undervaluation of the website, Match.com was sold for a mere $7 million in 1998, which is about $10.7 million in today's money, with Kremen only getting about $50,000 of that for the idea and his effort in building the site. Just a little over a year later, the site sold again for $50 million, with only small changes to the site in the interim. Kremen said of the previous sale, "Talk about mispricing." But we are not here today to talk about Match.com, so let's rewind all the way back to 1994 when Kremen, a holder of a bachelor's degree in computer science and another in electrical engineering, as well as an MBA from Stanford Business School, saw great potential in online businesses and thus made a practice of snapping up domains that he thought would work great for various e-businesses that he had ideas for. So when he noticed that Sex.com was available, he nabbed it via the registrar Internic. This registrar was later acquired by Network Solutions. Of course, at the time, himself having long struggled to find a steady girlfriend, Kremen was busy attempting to give the world of dating a major upgrade via introducing the aforementioned online dating service Match.com, so he set Sex.com aside to do something with it later. Important here is that when Kremen did register Sex.com, while he named his non-incorporated company Online Classifieds as the owner of the domain, he put himself as the sole point of contact. Seemingly, this should have made it pretty difficult for someone to steal Sex.com from him, but at the time, as noted, few people had any real notion that domains should have value, even, as it turns out, Network Solutions. In fact, at least according to their later legal argument in a case with Kremen, they stated they considered domains more like phone numbers than property that someone actually owns. Okay, so at this point, Stephen Cohen enters the picture. Besides supposedly having a Juris Doctor degree from Southern California Law School, over the course of his life, Cohen's been involved in a shockingly high number of schemes. For example, according to a lawyer friend of his, one Roger Agajanian, Cohen even once successfully impersonated a judge in Colorado for several years, including, to quote, letting people off all the time while he acted as a judge. Now, while he was arrested numerous times over the years for his various exploits, he was actually pretty adept at staying out of jail. Indeed, he also managed to pretty much avoid paying any money to anyone he had defrauded, as well as various creditors, via, according to that previously mentioned lawyer, playing procedural games, including hiding assets until those he'd conned just eventually gave up trying to get anything from him. Alright, so let's fast forward a bit and get to the late 1980s. This brings us to an Orange County sheriff called Gary Jones, who'd been trying to catch Cohen for years. He initially started to chase Cohen because he found out that he had been stealing expensive cars from people via pretending to impound them when the people fell behind on payments, as well as operating a phony law firm. Indeed, during this time, he apparently even had the audacity to threaten Sheriff Jones's family, which, to quote Jones, made it personal, so every time that guy sneezed, I knew. But even under such close scrutiny, he still seemingly had little trouble keeping up his various illegal activities. But finally, in 1991, the master con man finally had a stint in prison at the Federal Correction Institution Lompoc in California. This was for his involvement in a bankruptcy fraud scheme, where among other duplicitous activities, he brazenly posed as a variety of different lawyers in the case. We could go on for hours about the various fascinating activities that Cohen got up to over the decades as he mastered the craft of not only being a con man, but also someone who seemingly could give the world's top lawyers a lesson in how to exploit the US legal system to get away with apparently almost anything. Now, perhaps we'll save those for another day, because today we want to get on and focus on just one of his little escapades, and that's of course the Sex.com heist. On February the 1st of 1995, Cohen was released from prison. Seemingly not long after, he set his sights on acquiring Sex.com. Rather than make an offer to the rightful owner, Kremen, to buy it or even create a partnership of some sort, which actually might have really worked out for both of them, he seems to have decided that he'd rather just steal it. To do this, he settled on an ingeniously simple plan, which he put into motion on October the 15th, 1995. Cohen began by forging a letter from the president of Kremen's online classifieds, Sharon Dimmock. Using a fake, seemingly official-looking letterhead in the letter, Dimmock, on behalf of online classifieds, noted that Kremen had been fired and that they were relinquishing all rights to Sex.com to Cohen. Moreover, in the letter it stated that, because we do not have a direct connection to the internet, we request that you notify the internet registration on our behalf to delete our domain name Sex.com. Further, we have no objections to your use of the domain name Sex.com, and this letter shall serve as our authorization to the internet registration to transfer Sex.com to your corporation. Of course, Sharon Dimmock didn't exist, but that didn't matter here. Upon being presented this letter, Network Solutions somewhat surprisingly transferred the domain to Cohen's company, Sporting Houses Management, just 2 days later on October the 17th. They did this apparently without even bothering to try to contact the one person who was listed as a contact for Sex.com, and that was of course Gary Kremen. Kremen would later note on October the 18th, "I woke up and it was gone. It's like someone forging the title to your house and then taking it over." Naturally, he contacted Network Solutions to ask what had happened and to get the domain back, noting that he'd never authorized any such transfer, but they claimed that they had an internal policy not to get involved in any dispute about ownership of domains and refused to transfer it back. Presumably here we could assume that he would have actually just had much better luck if he forged a letter from Cohen telling them to transfer the domain back to him. Now, of course, Cohen wasn't about to give up his newest asset, leaving Kremen no alternative but to sue to try and get the courts to give it back to him. Now, originally, he was not really sure if he wanted to publicly associate himself with online porn via suing Cohen for Sex.com. There was another problem, and that was that Kremen knew the legal battle would be extremely expensive, and he didn't have the money at the time to pursue the case. So at that time, he simply decided to put it on the back burner. On top of this, when Kremen later began seriously looking into suing, he was contacted by a lawyer from the Patent and Trademark Office, and the lawyer advised him that suing Cohen would be a pointless act because Cohen had trademarked Sex.com retroactive to 1979 when Cohen had first started using that term, meaning that thanks to that trademark, there was almost no chance that Kremen would win. So now you might be wondering how Cohen could claim that he had been using Sex.com since 1979. Well, he claimed on his trademark application that he had been running an electronic bulletin board called the French Connection back in 1979, which, to quote, was a board for swingers, nudist camps, and alternative lifestyles. So basically a hookup bulletin board, and Sex.com was supposedly short for sex communications, and that was being used by Cohen back then. Cohen would later claim it was a very, very lucrative business. It's what became Sex.com today. Now, it is known that Cohen did actually once run such an electronic bulletin board service, and he later actually ran a real-world swingers meeting place in Orange County. This happened in the late 1980s, and it was called The Club. This is definitively known, among other reasons, because in 1990 Cohen was arrested for operating such a sex club in a residential zone, though was later somehow found not to be guilty by a jury. As to whether Sex.com ever had anything to do with any of this, it's generally thought that that's very unlikely. Whatever the case, according to Kremen, while Cohen did really file for such a trademark once he acquired Sex.com, it would later turn out that the Patent and Trademark Office lawyer Kremen had been discussing the matter with, and who for a time successfully dissuaded him from attempting the lawsuit, was none other than the con man who'd stolen Sex.com in the first place, Stephen Cohen. In any event, Kremen did not initially pursue legal action, and in the interim, Cohen attempted to create the Caesar's Palace of brothels and even a fantasy sex island, with Sex.com being the web presence for these business ideas. But all such plans fell through, and he simply began offering subscription porn on Sex.com, as well as running very lucrative ads as well. On top of that, even though he had not actually been granted the trademark for Sex.com, he nonetheless began suing everyone using related terms in their brands and the like. As Cohen put it in an interview, "We got lawsuits filed left and right for trademark infringement. We're constantly filing new lawsuits. Constantly. We have teams of lawyers at Ocean Fund who do nothing but file lawsuits." This seemingly was actually pretty lucrative in its own right, with some website owners at the time simply choosing to take a deal instead of paying all the legal fees needed to take the matter to court. Speaking of Ocean Fund, around this same time, Cohen sold Sex.com to a company called Sandman International in Mexico, a subsidiary of Ocean Fund International based in the British Virgin Islands. Naturally, though the paper trail is surprisingly difficult to follow, presumably by design, it would appear that this was all just a way for Cohen to move ownership of the domain to an entity which he owned based outside of the United States. However, Cohen's lawsuits here would just be the beginning of his undoing in the Sex.com heist. You see, while Kremen couldn't afford to go after Cohen himself, Cohen was making himself a lot of enemies in the world of online porn, some of which agreed to team up with Kremen to cover the legal costs of getting the Sex.com domain taken away from Cohen. And so it was that in the summer of 1998, Kremen finally decided to sue to get the domain back. Soon enough, however, many of the porn moguls that agreed to go into battle with Kremen abandoned the cause, but one lawyer, Charles Carrion, decided to stick it out with Kremen despite Kremen's lack of ability to pay. Later, when Cohen sued Kremen for defamation, Carrion had the bright idea to leverage certain terms in Kremen's homeowner's insurance plan with State Farm to obligate them to defend Kremen in the defamation case. With State Farm's large team of crack lawyers now on his side, the runaround Cohen was giving the court system began to fall apart. Around the same time, Kremen stated that he was able to liquidate the .com stock I had and put it all on red to beat Cohen. At this point, it was personal, no doubt partially fueled by the fact that apparently Cohen had a fun little habit of randomly calling Kremen to taunt him or otherwise just mess with him in a variety of different ways. Cohen didn't help himself later when he was caught on camera posing as one of Kremen's lawyers and stealing 113 pages of his own bank's records that Kremen's legal team had uncovered, which, by the way, apparently included definitive records of him transferring some $25 million made from Sex.com offshore, and this was probably just a portion of what was actually a whole lot more. When this theft was first revealed, for the first time, the court system started considering that maybe the smart-looking, smooth-talking network solutions-backed Cohen wasn't the upstanding businessman he appeared to be, and the eccentric, socially awkward Kremen, who looked pretty much as you'd expect, might actually not be crazy after all. But while this court battle was being waged, as you might have guessed from that $25 million figure previously stated, Cohen was making the most of his stolen property. At its peak, and this is according to Cohen, so do take it with a grain of salt, his earnings were around $225 million per year, thanks to having about 9 million subscribers paying $25 a pop, plus additional revenues from advertising, which he claimed brought in about $1 million per month. As Cohen once bragged in an interview, "Let me make it real simple for you. Our audience is not America, it's the whole world. There's only one word in the whole world that everyone understands: sex. You type the word sex, you come to Sex.com." Of course, Cohen could have been making up these fantastical sums, but based on estimated traffic at the time, which included somewhere in the vicinity of 140 to 700 million page views per month at its peak, and revenues that Kremen would later receive in ads when he got Sex.com back, it's generally thought Cohen made about $100 million from Sex.com in the 5 years that he controlled the domain, though given his absolute refusal to share such financial records with the courts, even when ordered, it's difficult to say for sure. Whatever his real earnings, being well-versed in the law and able to afford the best lawyers to boot, Cohen successfully dragged out the case for 2 years, making a variety of arguments, such as that because Kremen's Online Classifieds was not officially a registered company at the time he listed it as such when acquiring Sex.com, it could not have possibly ever actually owned Sex.com. One of Cohen's lawyers added to this, thus Online Classifieds' allegation that it was the owner of the Sex.com URL has no basis in fact and is tantamount to perpetrating a fraud. Yep, that side brazenly accused Kremen of fraud. Finally, in November of 2000, the courts ordered that the ownership of Sex.com should revert back to Kremen, and that Cohen owed Kremen a total of $40 million of the estimated $100 million in revenue Cohen had supposedly made in the 5 years that he had possessed the domain. Further, the court added an additional $25 million in punitive damages, bringing the total owed to Kremen to $65 million. Naturally, Cohen had no interest in paying a dime to Kremen. Although the district court froze Cohen's known assets, basically this means they just issued an order on paper, this seems to have posed little impediment to Cohen, who seemingly already had planned for such a contingency. Beyond leaving the country himself, he'd already wired everything liquid to a variety of accounts offshore, and even stripped his real estate, which would soon be awarded to Kremen after another extended court battle, of everything of value, including the doors and the toilets. Later, the mansion was vandalized directly before Kremen was to take possession of it, with it generally thought that Cohen was behind that too. As to why Cohen officially claimed he could not pay anything to Kremen, despite having made a boatload of money off of Sex.com, it would appear directly after losing the court battle that all of his companies had simply gone bankrupt at the same time, and his own personal finances also mysteriously went to zero. Although the court ordered Cohen to return to the US and show cause for his apparent contempt, he ignored the order and remained out of the country. He did, however, briefly get arrested in Mexico for trying to smuggle some money back into America. After he was caught, he simply stated that he had been trying to pay Kremen, as the court had ordered him to do, before the authorities got in the way. The trial court then declared him a fugitive from justice and an arrest warrant was issued, but it couldn't be served. About this time, Kremen himself posted a wanted poster with a $50,000 reward on Sex.com, which only played into Cohen's hands further. Cohen then claimed he not only couldn't return to the United States, but that the arrest warrant should be rescinded because between that and the reward for his capture, the authorities and bounty hunters outside of his Mexico residence were allegedly engaging in gunfights to see who could apprehend him. He argued that this was something that posed a threat to his and other people's lives. The trial court was nonplussed and refused his request. Cohen managed to keep himself out of the reach of US authorities for 5 years, despite, according to Kremen, regularly still calling to taunt him over the Sex.com heist, and even once offering Kremen shares in the controversial file-sharing system EarthStation 5 that Cohen had helped found. Naturally, Kremen had no interest in taking stock in one of Cohen's companies over, actual money. Things changed when Cohen was arrested in 2005 in Mexico for violating immigration laws. You see, Kremen had discovered that Cohen had divorced his wife, Rosa, which meant he needed a different visa to stay in Mexico. Naturally, Kremen passed this information on to US Marshals, which meant that when Cohen went to get his proper visa in person, he was arrested. You see, when standing in the immigration office, Cohen didn't yet have the visa, so officially he was in violation of Mexican immigration laws and in a location authorities knew that he would be. And so it was that he was shipped back to the United States, where he spent a surprisingly short time in prison before being released on December 5th, 2006. So now you might be wondering, well, this is when Kremen gets some of that money, right? Well, as you might imagine, no. Cohen claimed poverty and backed it up with documentation showing that he had no assets or money to speak of. Now, sifting through the paper trail of at least 12 companies around the world, as well as various individuals, is a pretty complex task, but the courts are not buying that he's in poverty. And they still aren't buying it, at least as recently as 2011, which is the last court rulings that we could find connected to the case. At this time, the case was still ongoing, with some people close to Cohen having their bank accounts frozen because, well, they had huge amounts of money in them. In terms of whether Kremen would actually ever get access to the many millions of dollars in said frozen accounts, in addition to the millions more Cohen is thought to have stashed around in unknown accounts, well, this is still up in the air. But Kremen has said to Cohen on one of those calls where he gets taunted, "I tell him it's going to happen with or without lube, so lie down and get it over with." To date, though, he's still waiting on the now over $80 million that's owed to him when you include interest. But don't feel too bad for Kremen. Beyond running his own version of Sex.com, which made $500,000 per month before the dot-com bubble burst, and he later sold for $14 million in 2006, which is $17.5 million today, there was still the matter of Network Solutions. You see, Network Solutions had transferred the ownership of his valuable property without ever notifying him in any way that they were doing this. Thus, Kremen set his sights on Network Solutions and its parent company, VeriSign, who acquired Network Solutions for a whopping $21 billion in the year 2000. He alleged 4 causes of actions in this particular lawsuit, including breach of contract and conversion. This is taking someone else's property. The trial court rejected the breach of contract claims because Kremen never paid for the domain name registration. Again, back then you could register for free thanks to the National Science Foundation, so there was no consideration. Consideration is something of value that Kremen pays in exchange for the domain name and completes a contract. This was something that was later upheld on appeal. Network Solutions also argued with some success that it was akin to a phone company, with domain names essentially just being phone numbers. As a lawyer for Network Solutions, Phil Sbarbaro stated, "A domain name is not property, it's a service." However, the trial court's rejection of the conversion claim was overturned by the Court of Appeals. The Ninth Circuit noted that while traditionally the tort of conversion only applied to tangible items like a car, but not intangible things like information or the right to enforce a license or registration, this was an old-fashioned view of property and its value, and accordingly the appellate court reversed the trial court's rejection and returned the claim, ruling that Network Solutions was indeed liable for damages here, owing to having transferred the ownership of property without any authorization. This was actually a landmark case from a legal perspective. Many of the laws pertaining to real property now applied to domains. This finally afforded domain owners some concrete legal protections concerning their property. Within a year, Kremen and VeriSign settled the claim, reportedly for an amount in excess of $15 million, which is $20.5 million today. Then, of course, there was also the matter of Kremen's sale of Jobs.com, Housing.com, Autos.com, Sex.net, Computer.com, a sale of a patent he had held for dynamic web pages for a cool $1.25 million, and money made from several companies he created and sold in the last few decades. On top of that, Cohen's former 8,900 square foot mansion in Rancho Santa Fe that was awarded to Kremen, which he lived in for a time, sold for $4 million in 2009. Also, various bits of Cohen's property have been awarded to Kremen over time as the courts can get their hands on them. On that note, Kremen has stated that he's not yet gotten enough back in said liquid assets to pay his legal fees, which are in excess of $5 million. More recently, Kremen's taken to investing in dozens of renewable energy startups. So you could say that financially he's doing alright, despite the fact that he's owed $65 million plus interest from Cohen. By all accounts, though, the two actually seem to regularly converse, usually taunting one another over the latest events in their joined and sordid saga. Alright, so I really hope you are enjoying this video so far, and just before we get into the bonus facts for today's episode, let me tell you a bit more about Dashlane. Now, you might not be likely to fall victim to a big heist like the one we saw in today's video, but security on the internet is a really serious business, and that is why you should be using Dashlane. Now, I don't know about you, but I personally get hassled all the time to create super secure passwords. I mean, you need to use a capital letter, and then you need to use a random character, and then you need to have a number, and then it's got to be 17 digits long, and they also want you to use a hieroglyph. Okay, I made that last one up, but you are beginning to get the idea. Secure passwords, though, they are super important, but they're kind of impossible to remember, so how do you do that? Well, that, of course, is where Dashlane comes in. You can start by having them create a super complicated password that you'll never actually remember, actually a good thing, and then Dashlane will log you in with your username and password whenever you visit a site. It's pretty great. Alright, but you might be thinking in your head now, it's like, yeah, I've heard of password managers, Simon, I know they do this, it's not really a big deal, but Dashlane, they do all of that and then they kick it up a gear. You've probably heard about data breaches, the Sony one is always one that comes to mind for me, and you think, oh god, do I have an account with Sony and what passwords do I have the same as with that one? Well, Dashlane is pretty amazing at damage control. They'll notify you when there's a data breach that affects one of your accounts, and then they'll tell you which passwords you have are the same as that data breach, so you can swap them out incredibly incredibly easily. And another great feature they have is how easy it is to change passwords with them. You don't have to go to a site, go through a dozen steps, get an email, click a link in an email, blah, 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 blah. You just click in the app, boom, done, password secure. And that's not even mentioning their features on mobiles. Until I used Dashlane, I just assumed that entering passwords on my mobile phone was going to be a huge pain in the ass, always was, but no longer a hassle. Easy. Now they do also have premium features, but the free app has loads of stuff and it's really great as well. Look, Dashlane is just a better way to manage passwords and it's free. You can get 10% off premium with the code TodayIFoundOut as well if you do want those premium features. So follow the link in the description below. That helps support us and it helps you get a more secure future on the internet. Win-win. And let's get into those bonus facts. Money isn't everything, and despite his enormous success over the years, Kremen was still in search of love well over a decade after getting fed up with 900-number dating services, and he decided to found Match.com to solve the problem for people such as himself. But eventually, wanting to find someone who loved him for who he was and not his wallet, he offered his friends a deal. If one of them could find him a wife, he would give them and their family an all-expenses-paid trip to Hawaii. This actually worked, and he was introduced to one Dr. Patricia Atnasova, who became Petra Kremen when they got married in 2008. Unfortunately, it would appear according to court records that on January the 29th, 2014, the couple filed for divorce, though the case is still ongoing over 4 years later. But there too, it's not all bad news. He did have 2 great kids in the interim. And speaking of kids, while he might not have made much money off of Match.com, thanks to it, Kremen has boasted that he was able to help make over 1 million babies, indirectly, of course. And now for another bonus fact. As previously noted, companies in the early 1990s were often so ignorant of the internet as a whole, let alone its potential as a tool for advertising, sales, and PR, that in the latter days of 1993, about half of all Fortune 500 companies had failed to even register their own name online. Companies started to cotton on to the value of domain names and the internet in the latter days of 1994, when a writer for Wired magazine called Joshua Quittner registered McDonald's.com, and in a fascinating time capsule of an article, jokingly mentioned he might try to sell McDonald's.com to Burger King. Before registering the domain, Quittner repeatedly reached out to McDonald's to politely inform them that the domain was available and they needed to grab it quickly before someone else did. As a result of Quittner's urgings, Jane Hulbert at McDonald's Media Relations discussed the matter with higher-ups in the company, to which they replied, "No one seems to know anything about the internet." Quittner ultimately decided to just register McDonald's.com himself, even though it wasn't yet clear from a legal standpoint if this constituted trademark infringement or not, something that was still, at the time, being fleshed out in court. He did eventually give the domain to McDonald's after the company agreed to provide free high-speed internet to a public school in Brooklyn. Quittner later reached out to Burger King, encouraging them to register BurgerKing.com before someone else did. He stated Burger King's initial response when he mentioned the internet was, "Is that some kind of information thing, like Prodigy?" So I really hope you enjoyed that video, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel for brand new videos just like this every day of the week. Also, I've got a podcast. It's called BrainFood, and it's content just like this, just in the podcast format. But we go into more depth and really get into all of the details on any particular subject. You can check it out through the links in the description below, or just search your favorite podcast app for BrainFood. And if you like this YouTube channel, you are sure to love that podcast. But if you want to watch something else right now, check out a related video from the past over there on the right. And as always, thank you for watching.